Now let me begin, and I want to begin at the beginning, which in this case is the mid-1990s, when Bob McCauley and Tom Lawson published an article, which you can see here, entitled "Who Owns Culture?" The article set out a pretty devastating critique of anthropology, challenging the widely held dogma that the only way to study cultural systems is to interpret them, rather than seek to explain them scientifically. 30 years later, interpretive exclusivism remains as entrenched as ever among anthropologists. Although their critique should really be taught as essential reading on all Anthro 101 courses, is not widely cited or taught in anthropology. Part of the reason for this neglect is that interpretive exclusivism is strongly allied with disciplinary exclusivism. Saying that so-and-so is not really an anthropologist is one way in which those within the anthropology tribe dismiss the scholarship of outsiders as wrong-headed or irrelevant. But many of those same people paradoxically accord guru-like status to philosophers. Examples you can see on the screen include Foucault, Derrida, Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Ricoeur, and Girard. Since Macaulay is undoubtedly a bona fide philosopher, he has the potential to become an anthropological guru. Or at least he would, but for one unfortunate impediment. Macaulay is, of course, the wrong kind of philosopher. In order for Macaulay to become a guru in anthropology, it would be necessary for him to give up on science. Since I fear there's little chance of persuading Macaulay to do so, the prospects of acquiring guru status in anthropology depend instead on successfully challenging the hegemonic status of interpretive exclusivism in that discipline. And so I've set myself that more modest goal in what follows. I will argue, building on McCauley and Lawson's critique, that the costs of interpretive exclusivism are heavy and the benefits illusory. Perhaps the most vaunted claim of interpretive exclusivism is that it gives voice to oppressed groups. In this context, the exclusion of science from the conversation is justified on the grounds that it is an instrument of imperialism. We're invited to believe that interpretivism is grounded in a noble desire to critique various forms of domination originating in colonial and patriarchal histories. Arguably, however, the very opposite is true. In order to combat social injustice, there's every reason to recruit the methods and findings of the sciences as well as the humanities, and to avoid an isolationist strategy. I'll argue that anthropology can best contribute to liberal objectives by working collaboratively with allied sciences in an inclusive spirit. One of the rationales for embracing scientific methods is that understanding the causes of cultural phenomena is necessary for developing effective interventions. By contrast, interpretive exclusivism produces a runaway inflation of meanings, degrading the value of theory and reducing the wider practical relevance of anthropology. So let's return to the question posed by McCauley and Lawson: who owns culture? The short answer, of course, is nobody, not even anthropology. Their article began by pointing out that anthropology's proprietorial claim to the concept of culture rests on three dubious assumptions. The first is that culture is an ontologically autonomous domain that can only be understood with reference to itself rather than with reference to factors outside it, such as the shaping and constraining effects of our evolved psychology, or the winnowing effects of cultural group selection. The second is procedural, that only cultural categories can be used to analyze culture, and consequently, the only way to study culture is to conduct long-term immersive fieldwork by means of participant observation. The third is that cultural phenomena cannot be disambiguated into discrete units for the purpose of conducting comparisons or reaching generalizations about their origins. As a result of these three assumptions, anthropology claims not only to own the concept of culture and deny the legitimacy of other disciplines to study it, but in the same fatal stroke, it rejects the possibility of explaining culture scientifically. Not only does this way of thinking make cross-cultural comparison pointless, it weirdly sanctifies ethnographic fieldwork as an intrinsically worthy activity in itself, rather than being merely a means to an end. As McCauley and Lawson put it, and I actually think this passage is worth reading out, actually quoting in full, the anthropological search for meanings feeds on new information about ethnographic details and cultural settings. In such an atmosphere, fieldwork becomes an end in itself. Being there has become virtually sufficient for professional credentials. Documenting the details of a culture that is largely like some other offers little interest. New, surprising, unexpected details are the fruit from which juicy new meanings are most easily squeezed. However, as they go on to argue, this approach provides no coherent way of distinguishing sweet fruits from bitter ones. The exercise becomes equivalent, one might argue, to studying the nature of mirrors by recording all the things that mirrors can reflect. There is no way of establishing which image in the mirror should be of particular interest, other than to note that some images are new or surprising, or to construct fanciful narratives about how the reflections make one feel or what associations they trigger. The value of the observation can then easily come to be seen merely as a function of the perceived originality or aesthetic appeal of the interpretive exercise, encouraging ever more elaborate interpretations that are increasingly distant from the original observation. While this could be of interest from a literary perspective, it is far from clear why it should be seen as the only way of appreciating mirrors. Why exclude the possibility of investigating how mirrors reflect light in predictable ways under different conditions? Why distortions occur? Or how, at a more advanced level, diffuse reflection differs from specular reflection, or incident light is converted into reflected light? Even more interesting still, from a practical perspective, are questions about how mirrors could be used to enhance the power of telescopes, the functioning of cameras, or the ability to insert fillings in your teeth. To interpret what your mirror reflects in a field setting is only one rather dull thing that you can do with a mirror, and to forbid all other lines of inquiry and innovation is needlessly straitjacketing. And yet that is exactly what interpretive exclusivism requires us to do. The solution to the problem of interpretive exclusivism is simple. Stop it. Embrace science. The benefits are instantly apparent and boundless. It's not that all the painstaking discoveries of past anthropology are suddenly devalued, but the very opposite, that they now become genuinely useful as a way of opening up questions of a comparative kind. We can then begin to ask if there are any fundamentally recurrent features of what we observe in widely differing environments, and what the main patterns of variation might be. This in turn would naturally prompt questions of causality, encouraging us to adopt an increasingly sophisticated array of methods for pursuing answers. Ethnographic fieldwork would then be restored to its rightful place as a means to an end, rather than an end in itself. So what should we call this alternative to interpretive exclusivism? It may be tempting to call it interpretive inclusivism, but there are some good reasons for not doing so. Those who remember reading this book, Lawson and McCauley's Rethinking Religion, published over 30 years ago, will appreciate why. For a start, interpretive inclusivism, as practiced by some anthropologists, still accords interpretation a privileged position over science. Indeed, The clue is in the phrase, which mentions interpretation, but not explanation. Interpretive exclusivists may tolerate scientific insights, but they see them as peripheral in the study of culture. Instead, Lawson and McCauley recommend what they call an interactionist view of interpretive and scientific approaches, placing the two on an equal footing in a continual back and forth between the methods of participant observation and causal inference. Anthropology wasn't always such a hostile environment for science or preoccupied by parochial matters. In fact, once upon a time, it was widely regarded as the queen of the social sciences. In Britain, Bronislaw Malinowski famously sought to establish what he called a scientific theory of culture. And many of those who came after, Mary Douglas, Raymond Firth, Meyer Forters, Max Gluckman, Edmund Leach, among many others, were animated by much the same explanatory ambition. In America, this creative explosion in the discipline was fueled also by figures like Marshall Salins, Leslie White, and Eric Wolf at Columbia University, who were likewise committed to interpretive and scientific interactionism. Unfortunately, with the takeover of Geertz's brand of interpretive exclusivism, and even worse, the rise of postmodern obscurantism, this legacy was rapidly overshadowed by a new kind of ruling elite in anthropology. Those still sympathetic to interactionism were mostly banished to the hinterlands of the discipline. There were, however, some notable guerrilla leaders, let's say, among them. And a good example of this, I think, was the Norwegian anthropologist Fredrik Barth. Barth's ethnographic research in Inner New Guinea shows how interpretive anthropology can contribute to new scientific theories and testable hypotheses. In 1968, Barth went to live among the Bactaman, one of a number of small indigenous groups living in the Ok mountain region of Inner New Guinea. Prior to this, direct contact with cultural groups outside the region had been very limited, and relations between the Bactaman and their neighbors were frequently hostile, roughly a third of all deaths being attributable to raiding and warfare. Barth's primary interest was in the way Bactaman religious knowledge was constructed through successive grades of initiation into a male cult. Despite the highly secretive nature of the rituals and the taboos on talking about them, Barth's account of this process was painstakingly detailed. Barth derived 4 insights from his study of Bactaman initiations that proved to be especially fruitful for the scientific study of culture. The first was that the transmission of cultural knowledge is an epidemiological process, an idea more fully elaborated later, of course, by Dan Sperber. That is, Barth recognized that cultural representations spread in any given population through a process of imperfect copying. Second, Barth observed that this process of transmission was mediated by memory. The fact that Bactaman novices underwent induction into each successive grade only once in a lifetime meant that the knowledge transmitted was subject to forgetting, garbling, and incremental change. Third, Barth proposed a link between shared suffering in rituals and group bonding. The ordeals of Bactaman initiations included being beaten with stones, stung on the genitals with particularly aggressive nettles, whipped, dehydrated, and forced to dance to the point of exhaustion. Barth astutely observed that all these experiences contributed to male solidarity and cohesive military groups, even though it was not yet clear exactly how they did this. Fourth, he proposed that undergoing such experiences triggered processes of reflection on problems of meaning and exegesis based on analogical principles, providing core features of cosmological knowledge, not only among the Bactaman, but among other groups in this region of New Guinea. He described this as a process of cosmology in the making, but it wasn't clear at the time how, if at all of these processes were connected up to things like social cohesion. A couple of decades later, I went to undertake fieldwork among another group in Papua New Guinea, the Mali Baining of East New Britain province. Like Barth, I was also initiated into the male cult. After returning from the field, I was struck by many similarities in our observations, and I began to wonder whether there was a causal relationship between the frequency of rituals, the way they were remembered and reflected upon, and the kinds of group bonding effects that we both observed, and also the patterns of intergroup conflict that were so typical of both the Backterman and the binding groups traditionally. In 1992, I published an article in the journal Man, now the JRAI, the one to which I plan to send this paper, outlining a general theory of how these dimensions might be related, drawing on both Barth's writings and on my own field observations. A couple of years later, my first book appeared, Inside the Cult, developing these ideas into a more elaborated theory. The starting point for this theory was that rarely performed rituals involving intense emotions like pain or fear, which of course is so typical of male initiations in many cultures, produce long-lasting episodic memories. Drawing on psychological studies of flashbulb memory, I argued that recall for ritual ordeals had a distinctively vivid and visceral quality that in turn motivated processes of reflection on problems of meaning and significance, along the lines of what Barth referred to as an analogical code, in which multiple layers of associations lend salience and gravitas to the tradition. I argued that the sharing of these memories and experiences with other group members generated strong forms of social cohesion, but also set strict limits on group size, since the memories only pertained to those who were co-present during the rituals. Consequently, the way in which Backterman and binding initiations were organized in memory strongly influenced the scale and structure of ritual groups, encouraging members to support each other in battle when defending their groups. As such, ritual frequency, memory, reflection, group bonding, and intergroup raiding and warfare were apparently all part of a single nexus of features, what I dubbed the imagistic mode of religiosity, referring to the kind of enduring images that these rituals seem to sear into the minds and memories of participants. Now, all these ideas and hypotheses sprang from a combination of description and interpretation, but it became increasingly obvious that the only way to test them was to turn to science. In practice, this process was characterized by three features. The first feature was qualitative generalization and comparison. It began with us asking whether the clustering of imagistic features observed among the Backterman and binding groups could be observed also in other rarely performed emotionally intense rituals. And in pursuit of an answer to that question, I wrote another book, Arguments and Icons, comparing such practices across numerous other groups in Papua New Guinea and in other regions of the world. That book in turn prompted interest from scores of scholars and scientists who, in a series of edited collections, began to explore the applicability of that theory to detailed case studies from different parts of the world, spanning across thousands of years of human history and prehistory. One of these books, entitled Mind and Religion, was of course co-edited with Bob McCauley following a conference at Emory. The second feature was quantitative generalization and comparison. One reason for adopting this strategy is that comparison based on purely qualitative case studies is vulnerable to selection bias. Maybe those interested in imagistic practices were attracted to the theory because it fitted with their own ideas and observations. But what if those who had data contradicting the theory were less inclined to join the conversation? Likewise, there was a risk that qualitative descriptions of imagistic traditions overemphasized features that conformed to the theory and downplayed those that didn't. But another reason why a quantitative approach was necessary was that qualitative case studies did not define the variables relevant to testing the theory in a way that could be measured. This was essential if we were to analyze statistically the extent to which features we were interested in were indeed correlated in a large sample of cases as predicted. And so we set out to build a series of databases capable of being analyzed statistically. The first of these was an ethnographic database coding roughly 100 variables pertaining to 645 rituals from 74 cultures around the globe. We then constructed a series of archaeological databases allowing a variety of strategies ranging from fine-grained comparison of data over thousands of years at a single site, to coarser-grained comparison of data over scores of sites across a much wider region and spanning much longer time periods. And finally, we built a global history data bank covering large numbers of rituals across hundreds of societies over thousands of years. These approaches required not only interdisciplinary dialogue, just as when comparing qualitative case studies, of course, but something far more challenging still, the design of data sets that met the highest standards of ethnographic, historical, and archaeological accuracy was clearly what we wanted to achieve, but in a way that would also enable data scientists to analyze the material statistically. That was, or achieving that, was much more than simply a matter of mere dialogue across disciplines. It required prolonged collaboration necessary to repackage the observations of qualitative researchers in a way that could be directly compared and quantified. The third feature of this interactionist approach was the use of carefully controlled experiments. The ethnographic observations that Barth and I had made at our respective field sites had generated testable hypotheses about the relationship between various features of ritual and social organization. For example, the theory of imagistic transmission predicted that rarely performed, emotionally intense rituals would generate more exegesis. One obvious way to test such a prediction was to manipulate the variables of interest and measure the effects of this on meaning making. Our first experiment along these lines, which Emma Cohen will remember, had undergraduate students perform collective rituals modeled closely on Backterman and Binding initiations, but assigning half the participants to a low arousal condition and half to a high arousal one, and then measuring the effects of this on the analogical richness of their interpretations of the experience afterwards. Later, we developed innumerable studies in populations that had naturally undergone imagistic experiences of various kinds. These studies typically took three forms: correlational designs, in which we measured the extent to which infrequent, emotionally intense ritual produced group cohesion and willingness to engage in extreme pro-group action, such as willingness to fight and die in intergroup conflicts. Priming studies, in which we, for example, we had half the participants remember an imagistic experience and half remember a non-imagistic experience, and then measured the effects of that on some set of outcome variables. And finally, longitudinal studies, in which we measured the effects of varied intensities of imagistic experiences on longer-term psychological and behavioral measures. As a result of many studies along these lines, which are sort of summarized in my latest book, The Ritual Animal, we now have a detailed picture of how the variables that Barth and I were interested in are causally related, not only among the Backterman and the Binding, but also among many other groups all around the world. Even more interestingly, we're now able to test hypotheses about the role that imagistic practices have played in the evolution of social complexity over the course of world history. By way of illustration, here are three examples of our main take-home discoveries. We now have compelling evidence from a host of empirical studies that sharing memories for life-changing rituals fuses our personal and group identities together and motivates extreme forms of pro-group action. Secondly, we found that this form of group bonding is very widespread in groups that have to stand together in the face of grave risks, for example, in military or paramilitary units. Thirdly, we found that such imagistic practices were widespread among ancient hunter-gatherers, but faded with the rise of farming. Eventually, they ended up being harnessed by states, for example, to help bond soldiers and ruling elites, or else were outlawed and forced underground. What began as a set of very narrow observations in a couple of tiny and remote communities set off a train of scientific research that has provided novel and testable insights into the way human societies have evolved over many millennia. All this was only possible by adopting an interactionist approach to interpretive and explanatory research. The parallels between Barth's observations among the Bactermen and mine among the Bining were not limited to ideas about imagistic experiences and analogic codes in traditional initiation rites. They extended also to an interest in more large-scale hierarchical religions. Both Barth and I were struck by the fact that the indigenous modes of cultural transmission we had recorded at our respective field sites contrasted starkly with more doctrinal belief systems. Barth was interested particularly in differences of leadership type. On the one hand were the gurus who led the doctrinal traditions of the transcendentalist religions of Asia, which Barth knew well from his fieldwork among Indonesian Hindus in Bali. And on the other hand, there were the indigenous leaders, the elders and ritual experts whom Barth studied among the Bactermen and described as conjurers because they helped their juniors to conjure up their own interpretations and insights into cosmological mysteries rather than telling them what to do or what to believe. I was struck by a similar idea, but initially drawing the contrast between varieties of missionary Christianity and indigenous imagistic cults in New Guinea. It seemed to me that the contrast between doctrinal and imagistic modes of religiosity were expressed not only in distinct patterns of leadership and revelation, but also in starkly divergent patterns of transmission, of memory, social cohesion, and group structure and scale. And I call this the theory of divergent modes of religiosity. The central idea here was that whereas imagistic practices were associated with low frequency, high arousal rituals, the opposite was true of the doctrinal mode, whose typical rituals were high frequency and comparatively low arousal. According to this theory, frequency and arousal impact group bonding and scale and structure as a result of the way they're processed in memory. If the rituals are rare but intense, as in the imagistic mode, they're typically recalled as life-changing events in episodic memory, shaping personal identities as well as defining tightly circumscribed groups. By contrast, if the rituals are comparatively frequent, as in the doctrinal mode, they're recalled in semantic and procedural memory as general scripts and schemas, which are more detached from autobiographical experience, producing more depersonalized forms of group alignment. The forms of social cohesion generated by the doctrinal mode are therefore expected to be more diffuse, but they're also capable of unifying much larger populations. And this is partly because guru-like leaders, as Barth described them, codify their teachings in speech, enabling them to proselytize and spread their ideas rapidly and efficiently. But it's also because frequently repeated beliefs and practices are less vulnerable to garbling and decay. Deviations are not only less likely to occur, but they're also easier to spot. The emphasis on the oratory of inspired leaders and their orthodoxies therefore encourages the growth of religious hierarchies capable of policing the tradition. In other words, routinization and hierarchy work together to make detection and punishment for unauthorized innovation possible. These are all testable hypotheses which have been the focus of much empirical research over the past few decades. But let's wind back the clock to the early 1990s. At that time, Bob McCauley was working with his long-term collaborator, Tom Lawson, to develop a theory of why certain rituals take consistently recurrent forms across widely differing cultural systems. This led them to propose the ritual form hypothesis. One of the main predictions of the ritual form hypothesis was that rituals tend to be either relatively low in frequency and high in emotional intensity, while others are much more frequent and low-key. Since both the ritual form hypothesis and the theory of divergent modes of religiosity were clearly making overlapping predictions, it became inevitable that the relationship between the two theories would need to be clarified. The ritual form hypothesis proposes that all religious rituals are mentally represented as actions, just like any other, in which, for example, an agent may act on a patient by means of an instrument. That is, just as a policeman may strike a protester with a truncheon, a priest may sprinkle holy water on an infant. But religious rituals differ from everyday actions by inviting us to imagine that a supernatural agent is involved in some way. For example, by acting through the agent, for example, through the priest performing a wedding ceremony, or through the patient of the ritual for example, where the god is seen as the recipient of an offering, or through the instrument of the ritual, for example, where the divine is thought to be present in a wafer swallowed during Holy Communion. According to the ritual form hypothesis, religious rituals therefore take three distinct forms: special agent rituals, such as rites of passage; special patient rituals, such as those petitioning the ancestors; and special instrument rituals, including, for example, various forms of blessing. McCauley and Lawson propose that depending on which form the ritual takes, we can predict the frequency with which a ritual is performed and its emotional intensity, two features that are fundamental to the theory of modes of religiosity. Specifically, they propose that special agent rituals are non-repeatable and non-reversible because we intuitively suppose that what the gods have done cannot be undone, thus making the rituals once-in-a-lifetime events and therefore low in frequency, and also occasions for exceptional gravitas because of the high status of the gods, requiring us to crank up the sensory pageantry of the ritual, amplifying its emotional impact. By contrast, both special patient and special instrument rituals are repeatable, since the appetites of the gods can never be assuaged, and this in turn leads to more frequent performances with lower sensory pageantry, given that the acts of mere humans require comparatively little fanfare. If correct, the ritual form hypothesis would explain why some rituals are low in frequency but high in arousal, while others are high in frequency and low in arousal, which is the starting point for the theory of modes of religiosity. McCauley and Lawson depict their synthesis of the two theories by means of a diagram resembling a peacock with a resplendent tail. The head of the peacock, and in that sense the driving force behind its behavior, corresponds to the predictions of the ritual form hypothesis, determining how frequently the ritual is performed. However, the body of the peacock corresponds to the consequences of ritual frequency, at least according to the modes theory, for the way the ritual is remembered, thought about, and codified. In other words, the modes theory predicts the downstream consequences of high-frequency versus low-frequency rituals represented by the many feathers of a peacock's tail. These are the effects of performing a ritual on various aspects of the social system in which the ritual occurs. Integrating the ritual form hypothesis and the modes theory in this way generates a raft of empirically tractable predictions. For example, we would predict that all imagistic religious traditions would have at their heart some type of special agent ritual, such as a rite of initiation, in which supernatural agents affect permanent changes on those undergoing it. And we predict that all doctrinal religions would be constructed around special patient or instrument rituals, in which adherents routinely carry out rituals to please, placate, or petition the gods. Among the alternative predictions is that ritual frequency varies somewhat independently of people's intuitions about the appropriate form of the ritual, based on how supernatural agents are thought to intervene, if at all. One possibility is that the frequency of any given ritual varies randomly, but that only those with the socially useful qualities of imagistic or doctrinal modes end up becoming stable features of the cultural repertoire, the rest being winnowed out. These are all empirical questions. Ryan Hornbeck and Justin Barrett argue that it's precisely its empirical tractability that makes the ritual form hypothesis and the predictions relating to imagistic and doctrinal modes different from most anthropological theories, even those aspiring to adopt an interactionist approach. Hornbeck and Barrett provide as examples of potentially promising scientific approaches Durkheim's theory that rituals generate cohesion, Malinowski's theory that rituals satisfy biological needs, and Rappaport's theory that ritual facilitates adaptive cooperation in response to existential crises. However, each of these theories remains untestable unless specifying precisely what features of ritual should have the predicted outcomes, and unless the outcomes themselves are measurable. Hornbeck and Barrett suggest various ways in which these criteria could be met, but they praise McCauley and Lawson for stipulating their theory in a manner that is amenable to testing in its current form. This is the natural starting point for an interactionist approach in both interpretive and scientific endeavors, because it's only by couching hypotheses in a testable form that we can hope to reap the benefits of explanatory pluralism, interdisciplinary collaboration, and incremental theory building. When we can get all of these things going at once, we reap yet another reward, and that is the capacity to impact the world to achieve more positive outcomes. This is the theme to which I now turn. If one of the objectives of anthropology, or indeed of the social sciences more generally, is to be relevant not only to surrounding disciplines, but to society at large, then the case for interpretive and scientific interactionism becomes even stronger. It may be hard to imagine how field observations in societies as remote as the Bactaman and the Binding of Papua New Guinea could lead to scientific theories capable of impacting large-scale societies and even strategies for global cooperation. However, that possibility is indeed opened up by adopting an interactionist approach. Consider the following examples. First, consider the problem of intergroup conflict. The rituals of the Bactaman and the Binding led us to hypothesize that rarely performed but emotionally intense experiences produce long-lasting episodic memories and processes of reflection that in turn produce strong forms of social cohesion capable of motivating heroism in warfare. This theory has inspired a small industry of research into the processes driving warfare and violent extremism in a wide variety of different groups. This is partly due to the fact that the theory of imagistic group bonding has been augmented by the development of a psychological construct known as identity fusion, a visceral sense of oneness with the group, which allows researchers to measure the effects of imagistic rituals on group cohesion and willingness to fight and die for their comrades. Scores of studies have shown that when personally self-defining experiences are shared with other members of the group, our personal and group identities become fused together. Once this happens, any attack on the group is taken personally, and so highly fused individuals will stop at nothing to defend the group, even to the point of making the ultimate sacrifice. These conclusions are based on studies of imagistic group bonding in a wide variety of different groups, from deadly clashes between rival football fans in countries like Brazil and Indonesia, to farmer-herder conflicts in Cameroon, and from armed revolutionaries in Libya to military veterans in conventional armies. One of the practical benefits of this research is that it holds out the prospect for early detection of terrorism threat based on the signals of imagistic group bonding that violent extremists inadvertently provide in their writings and speeches and manifestos. All these discoveries and their applications came about because of hypotheses generated by field research in remote regions of Melanesia when coupled with an interactionist approach to interpretation and explanation. Second, consider the problem of crime in the UK. Once again, it may seem far-fetched to imagine that research among the Bactaman and the Binding could possibly bring anything useful to the table when tackling that problem. However, research among prisoners and probationers suggests that imagistic group bonding could play a crucial role in both reforming ex-offenders and improving reintegration efforts when they're released into the community. In the UK, an organisation known as A Band of Brothers undertakes initiation rites for groups of young men coming out of prison, offering mentoring as part of what they call a rite of passage journey, which fosters a search for meaning and purpose in life. Building on similar ideas, another UK initiative known as the Twinning Project connects football clubs throughout the country to their local prisons, providing intensive coaching for inmates. My colleagues and I have been administering measures of imagistic group bonding with large numbers of prisoners participating in this program, just as we've been doing in our studies of West African initiation cults, military groups, fraternities, and other tight-knit organizations that carry out personally transformative rituals. And we're finding the same psychological processes at work in the Twinning Project. Our research on prisons and reoffending increasingly suggests that the fusion mechanism, which lies at the heart of imagistic group bonding, may hold the key not only to desistance among ex-offenders, but also to the willingness of prospective employers to offer second chances. The idea that imagistic bonding could lead to peaceful forms of pro-social commitment and cooperation has also inspired a raft of new research on global problems, such as the climate crisis. Just as the sharing of personally transformative experiences in Baptism and binding initiations lead to strong forms of pro-group action among initiated men, we found that perceived sharing of the pain of childbirth creates very strong bonds among mothers, and that these bonds can be used to motivate willingness to support other women as part of a global sisterhood. Building on these findings, we've shown that merely reminding people of imagistic experiences shared by humanity at large has a bigger effect on people's willingness to act on the climate crisis than even the most persuasive of scientific and moral arguments. A fruitful way of understanding the contrasting orientations of interpretive and explanatory approaches and why they should be integrated flows from the differences between thick and thin descriptions of cultural systems. This point is very compellingly made in a recent article by Bob McCauley in the Journal of Cognition and Culture. In this article, McCauley observes that the goal of thick description is to document connections between the local and the particular in a cultural system. And this is upheld by interpretive exclusivists, as we know, as the only legitimate goal of anthropology. And yet many of the cultural constructs that people use in local and particular settings have much wider currency. For example, we found, as I've been saying, that the rituals of initiation, the initiation rituals that we've seen among the Baptism and the binding have lots of features that are common to societies as far away as Amazonia and West Africa and Europe. Recognizing these similarities is only possible by distilling from the local and particular somewhat thinner descriptions of behavior that can be generalized to a wider range of examples. It's precisely our capacity to do that that allows us not only to formulate and test generalizable hypotheses about the origins and spread of cultural phenomena, but to engage in even the most modest forms of cross-cultural comparison. The study of culture is greatly enriched by the ability to utilize thin description for the purpose of testing general theories. However, thin description in turn is ideally based upon and distilled from thicker description, which is to say that the promise of the explanatory enterprise often depends on the quality of the interpretive one. The Seychat project is premised on this fundamental insight. For example, our efforts to establish whether generalizable features of religion help to drive the rise of social complexity required a method of measuring potentially relevant features of religion in ways that were directly comparable across widely differing world regions and historical periods. But because research on, say, pre-colonial West African history takes place in a very different silo from research on Basin of Mexico or Big Island, Hawaii, we had to establish a bridging mechanism allowing us to compare like with like across the world regions in our database. This meant coding for a large number of features of religious belief in exactly the same way across hundreds of past societies, as well as coding data on changing levels of social complexity during the histories of each of those societies. In this way, thin descriptions of historical features provided the bridges between distinct political and cultural systems in the database. We currently have around 100 actively collaborating historians working with us to accomplish this feat, which means drawing on thick descriptions in historiography, while also converting that information into thinner descriptions that allow comparison across widely differing cultural systems. The point is that combining thick and thin descriptions is a necessary part of the scientific process. Championing the value of thin description, in this case, recurrent features of religion that are not unique to particular cultures but can be compared across them, also means championing the value of reliable, thick descriptions derived from more parochial and time-bound sources. In this example from the Seychat project, thin descriptions had to be distilled from a corpus of thick descriptions to enable us to carry out comparative analysis. Interpretive exclusivism would make such an enterprise impossible. So let's return to the big picture. Interpretive exclusivism deprives anthropology of the many benefits of interactionism. By limiting the methodological repertoire to immersive fieldwork and the pursuit of thicker descriptions and ever more distant interpretive strategies, it closes the door on generalization and comparison. But that's not the only downside of interpretive exclusivism. There are also strong moral arguments against it. In fact, it's quite ironic that defenders of interpretive exclusivism so often position themselves as champions of social justice, given that their strategy is inherently elitist. In effect, the approach turns anthropology into a kind of club, excluding those who reject its narrow-minded dogmas. Drawing in a greater diversity of members of the club may involve inviting small numbers of people from marginalized groups to join the elite, but only at the expense of the people they leave behind and whose interests are not served by interpretive exclusivism. Indeed, except perhaps for those who rise to the top of the anthropology profession, nobody's interests are served by interpretive exclusivism, since the practical relevance of the discipline for society at large is diminished behind a kind of veil of pretentious obscurantism lacking in explanatory power. In short, the case against interpretive exclusivism, summed up in this slide, is overwhelming. The fact that it continues to enjoy such high status in anthropology is a consequence of the way in which clubs reproduce their elitist orthodoxies. This is the case even when the discipline is hemorrhaging members and failing to replenish them. It's therefore hard to imagine why anyone would recommend interpretive exclusivism as a strategy for anthropology if it were not already sanctioned by the discipline's power structures. Looking to the future of anthropology, the appeal of an interactionist approach should be obvious and compelling. Ethnography would become a means to a palpably worthwhile end. Rather than sucking us into an interpretive vortex, it would open up new vistas of intellectual inquiry. By generating precise and testable hypotheses, the value of the enterprise to neighboring disciplines would naturally become more readily apparent. The tools of those neighboring disciplines would become available too, enabling anthropology to contribute to the design of experiments, surveys, longitudinal studies, and database construction. By strengthening the scientific foundations of the discipline, anthropology would become more relevant to society at large, to the policy community, and to the marginalized and oppressed groups it has a duty to defend. Science belongs to all of us. Since its methods are generalizing and inclusive, they are also practically useful and empowering. And so the real challenge is to make science accessible to all. So now that I've delivered the McCauley missile, what's left among the rubble? I would sum it up like this. In essence, rebuilding anthropology requires not an ontological turn, but a U-turn. By rediscovering its scientific roots and embracing interpretive and explanatory interactionism, the discipline would soon become less concerned with policing its borders or worrying about whether authors or their work should be counted as anthropological. Instead, it would be more open to methodological pluralism and intellectual diversity. It would contribute to interdisciplinary knowledge creation by creating much needed description and interpretation of cultural variation. It would maximize its practical relevance by embracing rather than excluding scientific methods. And a desirable byproduct of all of this would be improvements to the long-term prospects, not only of anthropology, but of all branches of the social sciences and humanities. Thank you.
Hello.
Oh, that's very dramatic.
Can you
Hello.
hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Neil Van Leeuwen here. So I quite agree with you in opposing, and Bob, of course, in opposing interpretive exclusivism and favoring interactionism. But I wanted to float a hypothesis about the source of interpretive exclusivism that makes it not merely a product of institutional prejudice or territorialism, by means of an example. So suppose I'm at a magic show and I'm watching the show, it's dazzling. And on my right is an interpretive exclusivist. And on my left is Bob McCauley. And we arrive at the intermission. And first, the interpretive exclusivist starts describing things to me, the meaning, the symbolic meaning of the various events the dazzling, apparently supernatural stuff, why it's important for this culture and so on, that these things happen. And it's all quite interesting and fascinating, and it sort of heightens my experience. After that, Bob starts telling me about the rigging, how the mirrors work, how the smoke came on just at the right moment, and also starts telling me about how my own innate psychological biases, maturationally natural psychological biases gave rise to the experience and so on. And I think it's fair to say that as much as I admire that sort of thing myself, it would be a sort of deflating description of things in relation to the symbolic interpretation, so to speak, of the events in front of me. And furthermore, the suggestion is it would be hard to see how Bob could do anything of that sort without deflating what the interpretivist is up to. So what I wanted to ask is if you think there really might be some sort of tension there when it comes to the discussion of cultures and in particular religious rituals, that there is a sort of deflating effect of the naturalistic scientific approach that is not merely incidentally in tension due to institutional prejudices, but is always kind of going to be that way, no matter how hard we try. Is there anything to that hypothesis?
It seems to me that both of these people that you went to the theatre with in your imagination were having very interesting experiences. But I don't see how the one deflates the other. I mean, it seems to me that if you really want to understand why a theatrical event has the psychological impacts it does, if you really want to understand it at multiple levels, it's important to consider that what's going on behind the scenes as well as what's going on overtly on the stage. And I don't think the one somehow impoverishes the other. I think the point about an interactionist approach is that it allows us to consider both of those dimensions together. For example, the only reason why the clever things that go on behind the scenes are actually effective is because we have the kinds of minds that can interpret and understand the drama that's playing out on the stage. We need to see these things together. And I think what I find depressing about interpretive exclusivism is its insistence that there is only one way of looking at it, and that if we extend our interest to these other dimensions, we somehow have this automatic deflationary effect. I think it's the opposite. I think we have an enriching effect by bringing all, but maybe ultimately, yeah, I mean, some people, I guess, will experience it as deflating. I know that a lot of people reacted badly to the title of Pascal Boyer's Religion Explained book for that reason, that it somehow deflated religion. But I've never really seen it that way.
Hello, my name is Marianne Florian. I received a certificate in mind, brain, and culture and studied with Bob McCauley here at Emory. I have a remark and a question. So I've greatly appreciated your presentation. It seems to me it has the added value of highlighting the humanistic or even philanthropic potential of CSR and less interpretively exclusive anthropology more broadly. And I don't mean philanthropy in the sense of charitableness, but rather as the antonym of misanthropy. I find misanthropy to be an accepted academic flavor profile that we would all do well to avoid when we write about religion. So this kind of love of the human and care for the human could return our focus in anthropology to understanding what we share rather than solely in understanding what is other, what is special, or what is in danger of being lost among specific cultural groups, even though learning these things is quite worthwhile. And it struck me also that you noticed or mentioned that the Journal of the Royal Society for Anthropology changed their name from the gendered man to this acronym of group identity rather than the less gendered human. So my question is, I've long noticed that if I pay attention to the subjective experiences that individual religious practitioners report, people who participate in imagistic and in doctrinal styles of ritual, I discern more of a mixing of the high and low arousal modes and moments of ritual, even in a single ritual enactment. And how would you recommend or imagine theorizing the impact of this mixing on both the memorability of the ritual procedures and the memorability of the perspectives and teachings that the ritual conveys?
Can I just quickly respond to the first point? Because I think it's, if I understood it correctly, I think it was such a lovely point that you made, that one of the benefits of trying to look at some of these sort of recurrent features of human thinking and behavior across the world as a whole is that it makes us more acutely aware of our common humanity. One of the benefits of interactionism over interpretive exclusivism is precisely that it allows us to grasp our commonalities as human beings rather than our focusing endlessly on differences. So I really like that point. This question about, some high frequency rituals being very intense emotionally and some low frequency ones being rather dull and boring, this has always been an issue, right? So the mode theory does not claim that those things are impossible, but that they are relatively rare. But that doesn't make them uninteresting, in the sense that I say relatively rare. When we analyze very large numbers of rituals, they tend to cluster around these two poles. But that doesn't mean you don't get any in the middle. And the ones that occur, the mixed modes, or other phrases have been used to describe these, they're very interesting. And I think some of them are actually, in a way, combines the strengths of both and also bring in weaknesses of both. So, we've been studying a phenomenon that we call extended fusion, which involves a certain amount of sort of doctrinal mode pathways to identification. That's to say, a form of group alignment where you have very little investment of your personal self in it, and it's a very strong emphasis on stuff that you've acquired through social learning from others in the group, and is therefore very much in line with the sort of framework of a doctrinal mode, but which can tap into quite personally salient ideas and experiences to the extent that it creates this sort of extended fusion, which is somewhat imagistic. And so we've had a whole series of studies of different phenomena where this is going on, in religious fundamentalists, in political groups, ideologies, as well as, secular ideologies, as well as religions, tap into this thing. So it's not like a phenomenon that doesn't interest us. And my colleagues, people I work with in psychological experiments, it's actually a really, really interesting area. Anyway, so thanks for bringing it up.